My future mother-in-law snatched my bank card from the kitchen counter and demanded my PIN number. When I calmly said no, my supposedly perfect fiancé snapped. He blocked my only exit from the kitchen, his face contorted with rage, and raised his fist to strike me just to please his mother. They fully expected me to cower in fear like a terrified victim. Instead, relying on 3 years of self-defense training, I looked him dead in the eye, raised my leg, and delivered a debilitating kick straight to his knee. Before I share how this single moment of self-defense unraveled a massive criminal conspiracy, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fiercely protect yourself from toxic people. My name is Whitney, and I am 33 years old. I am the founder of a highly successful forensic accounting firm in Chicago. I spend my days analyzing complex financial records, tracking hidden assets, and exposing corporate fraud. Yet despite my professional ability to spot deception from a mile away, I was entirely blind to the massive con artist living in my own home. For 2 years, I believed I was engaged to a charming, successful luxury real estate agent named Chase. He was 34, impeccably dressed, and always knew exactly what to say to make me feel cherished. But the man I loved was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, an illusion managed and directed by his incredibly entitled mother, Diane. The illusion shattered completely on a rainy Tuesday evening exactly 6 weeks before our scheduled wedding. I had just returned to my downtown Chicago condo after a grueling 10-hour workday. My condo was my sanctuary. I had purchased it entirely on my own before meeting Chase. It featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, custom hardwood floors, and a massive marble kitchen island where I loved to cook to unwind. But that evening, there was no peace waiting for me. Instead, I walked into my home to find Diane pacing around my kitchen like she owned the place, while Chase sat casually on a bar stool, sipping a glass of my most expensive wine. The tension in the room was suffocating. Before I could even set down my laptop bag, Diane marched right up to me. She did not say hello. She did not ask about my day. Instead, she slammed a heavy, ivory-colored folder onto the marble island. She crossed her arms and glared at me with absolute disdain. She announced that there was a sudden crisis with the wedding catering and the floral arrangements. According to her, the vendors required an immediate non-refundable deposit to secure their services, or our entire wedding would be ruined. She then casually stated that the deposit was exactly $45,000. I stared at her in complete disbelief. I asked her to repeat the number, thinking I must have misheard her. Diane let out an exasperated sigh, speaking to me as if I were a slow child. She repeated the figure $45,000 and extended her hand toward me. She told me to hand over my premium bank card and give her the PIN number right this second so she could wire the funds before the vendors closed their offices for the night. I looked over at Chase, expecting him to intervene or at least explain this sudden astronomical expense. Instead, he just swirled the wine in his glass and gave me a soft, pleading smile, asking me to just help his mother out so they could check this task off the list. I placed my laptop bag on the floor, took a deep breath, and calmly told Diane no. I was not giving her my bank card, and I certainly was not giving her my PIN number. Diane gasped dramatically, clutching her chest as if I had just slapped her. She turned to Chase, demanding that he control his future wife. I kept my voice perfectly level as I reminded them both of the financial agreements we had made months ago. I pointed out that I had already paid entirely out of my own pocket for the luxury venue at the Drake Hotel. I had paid for my custom gown, the photographer, and the live band. Chase had explicitly promised that he and his family would handle the catering and the florist. Those were his only financial responsibilities for this wedding. Chase shifted uncomfortably on his stool. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and put on his best persuasive real estate agent voice. He claimed that the luxury housing market was currently a little slow. He said his commissions were tied up in escrow, and he just needed me to front the cash temporarily. He promised he would pay me back the moment his next big mansion sale closed. I crossed my arms and looked him straight in the eyes. I reminded him that the housing market had supposedly been slow for the past 8 months. I reminded him that I was the one paying the mortgage on this condo. I was the one paying for our groceries, our utilities, and our lavish dinners out. I was even the one who paid the lease on his imported sports car last month because he claimed a client check had bounced. Diane slammed her hand flat against the marble countertop, her face turning a dark shade of red. She told me I was being an incredibly selfish and stingy bride. She practically spat the words at me, declaring that a good wife supports her husband without keeping a petty scorecard. She mocked my working-class background, stating that people who grew up with nothing never know how to act with grace when they finally get a little bit of money. She said I was lucky a man of Chase's caliber was even willing to marry me, and that handing over $45,000 was the least I could do to show my gratitude to their family. Her words were meant to make me feel small, to trigger the insecurities I had fought so hard to overcome while building my business. But her insults had the opposite effect. They only brought my forensic accounting instincts to the forefront of my mind. Nothing about this situation made logical sense. Catering and floral deposits for a wedding of our size did not suddenly jump to $45,000 overnight. Reputable vendors did not demand emergency wire transfers after business hours. And a successful luxury real estate agent should not need his fiancé to cover a car lease. I looked at the ivory folder Diane had slammed on the counter. I reached out to open it, wanting to see the actual invoices from these supposed vendors. The moment my fingers touched the cardboard cover, Diane snatched it away and held it tightly against her chest. She yelled that I did not need to audit her. She demanded respect and absolute trust. She told me that family does not demand receipts from family. I stood my ground. I told them both that until I saw a legitimate itemized invoice directly from the catering company and the florist, they would not see a single cent from my accounts. Chase stood up from his bar stool, setting his wine glass down so hard the crystal chimed against the marble. He told me I was being entirely unreasonable and paranoid. He insisted that his mother had spent weeks negotiating with the best vendors in Chicago and that I was insulting her hard work by demanding paperwork like a suspicious boss instead of a loving partner. I watched his body language change. The relaxed, charming posture he usually maintained was completely gone, replaced by a rigid, defensive stance. I calmly explained that a real partnership is built on financial transparency, not blind obedience. I told him that my hard-earned money was not a limitless fund for them to pull from whenever they manufactured a crisis. The atmosphere in my beautiful kitchen grew incredibly toxic as the realization settled between us. The man I was preparing to marry was not just financially irresponsible. He was actively trying to drain my resources to fund a lifestyle he could not afford. I watched the realization wash over his face that his usual manipulation tactics were completely failing. For the entirety of our relationship, Chase had relied on his smooth-talking charm to navigate his way out of any conflict. He would flash that perfect bright smile, lower his voice to a soothing register, and somehow twist reality until I found myself apologizing for doubting him. But tonight, that script was broken. I was not backing down, and the panic of not getting his hands on that money was causing his carefully polished veneer to crack. His jaw clenched so tightly that I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. The warm, loving light in his eyes vanished entirely, replaced by something cold, dark, and genuinely terrifying. He took a heavy step toward me, closing the physical distance between us, until he was standing uncomfortably close. The scent of his expensive cologne, a fragrance I had purchased for him for his birthday, suddenly felt suffocating in the narrow space of my kitchen. Diane watched him step up to me, a smug, satisfied expression settling onto her face. She practically beamed, clearly thrilled that her son was finally putting me in my place. She crossed her arms tighter over her chest and nodded at him, a silent encouragement to escalate the intimidation. I stood my ground, keeping my posture straight and my breathing steady, refusing to let them see the adrenaline spiking in my veins. I calmly asked him to step back and give me some space. I told him that hovering over me was not going to magically produce a $45,000 check. That was the exact moment his charming mask shattered completely into pieces. He did not step back. Instead, he lunged forward, closing the remaining gap between us and using his larger frame to physically back me against the edge of the marble island. The cold stone pressed sharply into my lower back. He shifted his weight deliberately, positioning his body to block the only clear walkway out of the kitchen. I was trapped between the counter, the heavy stainless steel refrigerator, and the man I had intended to spend the rest of my life with. He leaned down, his face just inches from mine, and the sheer hostility radiating from him made my blood run cold. His lips pulled back into a nasty, venomous snarl that completely distorted his handsome features. He slammed his hand flat against the counter right beside my hip, trapping me in place. Then he screamed the words that would officially end our relationship. "Not even married and you are already selfish." His voice echoed violently off the high ceilings of my condo. The volume and ferocity of his shout made the wine glasses on the counter tremble. Diane did not flinch. She just stood there watching the scene unfold with absolute approval, as if treating a partner with such vicious aggression was a perfectly normal family dynamic. Chase was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he glared down at me. He expected me to shrink away. He fully anticipated that I would cower, cry, and frantically offer him whatever he wanted just to calm his rage and restore the peace. He thought he had successfully terrified me into total submission. To ensure I understood how serious he was, he raised his right hand, pulling it back into a tight, trembling fist. The implication was unmistakable. He was fully prepared to strike me, to use physical violence to force compliance, all to please his mother and secure her approval. Time seemed to slow down to an absolute crawl. In that fraction of a second, as his fist hovered in the air, a profound clarity washed over my mind. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the paralyzing panic he was so desperately trying to induce. Instead, my brain instantly shifted into a purely analytical state, assessing the threat and recalling the intense physical conditioning I had put myself through over the past 3 years. When I started building my forensic accounting firm, I frequently worked late nights alone in empty office buildings. To make myself feel secure during those dark commutes home, I had enrolled in rigorous self-defense classes. I had spent countless hours in the gym, drilling defensive maneuvers until they became pure muscle memory. I had trained to react to sudden aggression without hesitation. Chase had no idea about those classes. He had always viewed my gym time as a cute little hobby to stay in shape for the wedding dress. As he loomed over me, confident in his physical superiority, I looked him dead in the eye. I did not blink. I did not look away. I held his gaze with absolute chilling certainty, letting him see that I was not the terrified victim he thought I was. Before he could even process the defiance in my expression, my body reacted with explosive speed. I planted my left foot firmly against the hardwood floor for stability, shifted my hips, and launched a devastating, perfectly targeted kick straight upward. The heel of my boot connected with absolute precision directly into the side of his right knee. The impact was accompanied by a sickening hollow pop that echoed sharply through the silent kitchen. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. All the aggressive, dominating energy drained from his body in a single heartbeat. His leg buckled completely under his weight, unable to support him any longer. The raised fist dropped uselessly to his side as a sharp, breathless gasp escaped his lips. His eyes went wide with pure, unadulterated shock, realizing too late that he had severely underestimated the woman he thought he could bully. He collapsed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, clutching his injured knee and groaning in deep, agonizing pain. He writhed on the ground, his previous arrogance entirely erased by the sudden debilitating strike. The mighty controlling man was suddenly reduced to a crumpled, whimpering mess on the floor of the condo I paid for. Diane shrieked in absolute horror, the sound piercing the quiet air of my home. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside her son, her hands hovering frantically over him as she wailed about what I had done to her perfect boy. I completely ignored her theatrics. Maintaining my absolute composure, I stepped carefully over his thrashing legs and walked directly toward the counter, where Diane had previously abandoned my bank card. I calmly picked up the small plastic rectangle and slid it securely into my pocket, ensuring my financial safety from their greed. Then I slowly pulled the sparkling diamond engagement ring off my left hand. The heavy stone caught the warm kitchen light one last time before I carelessly dropped it directly into Chase's half-empty coffee mug. It sank to the bottom with a quiet, dismissive splash, perfectly symbolizing the end of our fraudulent romance. I grabbed my heavy laptop bag, hoisted it onto my shoulder, and walked straight toward the front door without looking back. Chase was still groaning pitifully on the floor, and Diane was still screaming accusations at my retreating back, calling me a monster and a psycho. I did not care. I firmly pulled the heavy front door shut behind me, the solid click of the lock completely sealing them inside. The wedding was officially canceled, but as I stepped into the cool evening air, I knew the real war had just begun. I watched the realization wash over his face that his usual manipulation tactics were completely failing. For the entirety of our relationship, Chase had relied on his smooth talking charm to navigate his way out of any conflict. He would flash that perfect bright smile, lower his voice to a soothing register, and somehow twist reality until I found myself apologizing for doubting him. But tonight, that script was broken. I was not backing down, and the panic of not getting his hands on that money was causing his carefully polished veneer to crack. His jaw clenched so tightly that I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. The warm, loving light in his eyes vanished entirely, replaced by something cold, dark, and genuinely terrifying. He took a heavy step toward me, closing the physical distance between us, until he was standing uncomfortably close. The scent of his expensive cologne, a fragrance I had purchased for him for his birthday, suddenly felt suffocating in the narrow space of my kitchen. Diane watched him step up to me, a smug, satisfied expression settling onto her face. She practically beamed, clearly thrilled that her son was finally putting me in my place. She crossed her arms tighter over her chest and nodded at him, a silent encouragement to escalate the intimidation. I stood my ground, keeping my posture straight and my breathing steady, refusing to let them see the adrenaline spiking in my veins. I calmly asked him to step back and just give me some space. I told him that hovering over me was not going to magically produce a $45,000 check. That was the exact moment his charming mask shattered completely into pieces. He did not step back. Instead, he lunged forward, closing the remaining gap between us, and using his larger frame to physically back me against the edge of the marble island. The cold stone pressed sharply into my lower back. He shifted his weight deliberately, positioning his body to block the only clear walkway out of the kitchen. I was trapped between the counter, the heavy stainless steel refrigerator, and the man I had intended to spend the rest of my life with. He leaned down, his face just inches from mine, and the sheer hostility radiating from him made my blood run cold. His lips pulled back into a nasty, venomous snarl that completely distorted his handsome features. He slammed his hand flat against the counter right beside my hip, trapping me in place. Then he screamed the words that would officially end our relationship. "Not even married, and you are already selfish." His voice echoed violently off the high ceilings of my condo. The volume and ferocity of his shout made the wine glasses on the counter tremble. Diane did not flinch. She just stood there watching the scene unfold, with absolute approval, as if treating a partner with such vicious aggression was a perfectly normal family dynamic. Chase was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he glared down at me. He expected me to shrink away. He fully anticipated that I would cower, cry, and frantically offer him whatever he wanted just to calm his rage and restore the peace. He thought he had successfully terrified me into total submission. To ensure I understood how serious he was, he raised his right hand, pulling it back into a tight, trembling fist. The implication was unmistakable. He was fully prepared to strike me, to use physical violence to force compliance, all to please his mother and secure her approval. Time seemed to slow down to an absolute crawl. In that fraction of a second, as his fist hovered in the air, a profound clarity washed over my mind. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the paralyzing panic he was so desperately trying to induce. Instead, my brain instantly shifted into a purely analytical state, assessing the threat and recalling the intense physical conditioning I had put myself through over the past 3 years. When I started building my forensic accounting firm, I frequently worked late nights alone in empty office buildings. To make myself feel secure during those dark commutes home, I had enrolled in rigorous self-defense classes. I had spent countless hours in the gym, drilling defensive maneuvers until they became pure muscle memory. I had trained to react to sudden aggression without hesitation. Chase had no idea about those classes. He had always viewed my gym time as a cute little hobby to stay in shape for the wedding dress. As he loomed over me, confident in his physical superiority, I looked him dead in the eye. I did not blink. I did not look away. I held his gaze with absolute chilling certainty, letting him see that I was not the terrified victim he thought I was. Before he could even process the defiance in my expression, my body reacted with explosive speed. I planted my left foot firmly against the hardwood floor for stability, shifted my hips, and launched a devastating, perfectly targeted kick straight upward. The heel of my boot connected with absolute precision directly into the side of his right knee. The impact was accompanied by a sickening, hollow pop that echoed sharply through the silent kitchen. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. All the aggressive, dominating energy drained from his body in a single heartbeat. His leg buckled completely under his weight, unable to support him any longer. The raised fist dropped uselessly to his side as a sharp, breathless gasp escaped his lips. His eyes went wide with pure, unadulterated shock, realizing too late that he had severely underestimated the woman he thought he could bully. He collapsed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, clutching his injured knee and groaning in deep, agonizing pain. He writhed on the ground, his previous arrogance entirely erased by the sudden debilitating strike. The mighty controlling man was suddenly reduced to a crumpled, whimpering mess on the floor of the condo I paid for. Diane shrieked in absolute horror, the sound piercing the quiet air of my home. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside her son, her hands hovering frantically over him, as she wailed about what I had done to her perfect boy. I completely ignored her theatrics. Maintaining my absolute composure, I stepped carefully over his thrashing legs and walked directly toward the counter where Diane had previously abandoned my bank card. I calmly picked up the small plastic rectangle and slid it securely into my pocket, ensuring my financial safety from their greed. Then I slowly pulled the sparkling diamond engagement ring off my left hand. The heavy stone caught the warm kitchen light one last time before I dropped it directly into Chase's half-empty coffee mug. It sank to the bottom with a quiet, dismissive splash, perfectly symbolizing the end of our fraudulent romance. I grabbed my heavy laptop bag, hoisted it onto my shoulder, and walked straight toward the front door without looking back. Chase was still groaning pitifully on the floor, and Diane was still screaming accusations at my retreating back, calling me a monster and a psycho. I did not care. I firmly pulled the heavy front door shut behind me, the solid click of the lock completely sealing them inside. The wedding was officially canceled, but as I stepped into the cool evening air, I knew the real war had just begun. I walked for several blocks before the adrenaline finally began to recede from my bloodstream, leaving behind a cold, heavy exhaustion. The city lights of Chicago blurred slightly as I navigated the busy sidewalks, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders. I did not look back toward the building where I had spent the last 2 years, building a life with a man who turned out to be a complete stranger. Instead, I headed straight for a luxury hotel a few streets over. The lobby was quiet and softly lit, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence I had just escaped in my own kitchen. I booked a suite for the night, handing over my credit card to the concierge with a steady hand. Once inside the pristine hotel room, I locked the door, dropped my laptop bag on the floor, and finally allowed myself to breathe. I took a long, scalding hot shower, letting the water wash away the lingering tension of Chase's physical intimidation. I watched the water swirl down the drain, taking with it the carefully planned future I had envisioned just hours ago. The invitations were already mailed, the deposits were paid. But as I stood under the spray, I felt no urge to cry over a canceled wedding. I only felt an intense, overwhelming relief that I had discovered his true nature before signing a legally binding marriage certificate. I climbed into the crisp white hotel bed, fully expecting the situation to resolve itself by morning. In my logical, rational mind, the sequence of events was perfectly clear. I owned the condo outright. My name was the only one on the deed, the mortgage, and the utility bills. Chase had moved in a year ago, but he had never contributed a single cent to the equity of the property. I assumed that after being physically dropped to the floor and thoroughly humiliated in front of his overbearing mother, his fragile ego would force him to pack his bags and retreat. I figured he and Diane would gather his expensive suits, his imported watches, and whatever dignity he had left, and vanish into the night. I set my phone on the nightstand, confident that by the time the sun came up, my home would be empty, and I could begin the process of changing the locks and moving on with my life. I woke up the next morning feeling surprisingly clear-headed. There were no tears, no overwhelming waves of heartbreak or regret. The illusion of our perfect relationship had been so thoroughly shattered that there was nothing left to mourn. I ordered room service, drinking a cup of strong black coffee and eating a quiet, uninterrupted breakfast while I meticulously mapped out my day. I planned to head back to the condo around noon, giving Chase more than enough time to collect his belongings and vacate the premises. I even drafted a mental list of professional deep cleaning services I could hire to scrub the place from top to bottom, wanting to erase every physical trace of his existence from my sanctuary. I opened my laptop and began answering complex client emails, letting the familiar logical rhythm of forensic accounting ground me and restore my focus. Around 10 o'clock, my phone lit up on the desk next to my keyboard. A text message notification flashed across the screen. It was from Chase. I stared at his name for a moment, anticipating a pathetic apology or a notification that he had left the keys on the kitchen counter. I picked up the phone, unlocked the screen, and opened the message thread. What I read was so incredibly audacious, so completely detached from reality, that I actually had to read it 3 times just to process the sheer entitlement radiating from the words. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of his aggressive behavior, his raised fist, or his attempt to extort $45,000 from me. Instead, the message began with a deeply condescending tone, as if he were a disappointed parent reprimanding a toddler. He wrote that my violent and unhinged outburst last night was completely unacceptable, but that he was willing to be the bigger person and give me time to cool off and seek the psychiatric help I so clearly needed. He then casually mentioned that his knee was severely bruised and swollen from my unprovoked assault. Because of his debilitating injury, he informed me that he was currently unable to pack his belongings or navigate the stairs. And then came the line that made my blood run absolutely cold. He wrote that because he needed round-the-clock care and assistance, he had decided it was best for his mother to stay with him. He had officially moved Diane into my guest bedroom. He claimed she was there to nurse him back to health and manage his daily needs while he recovered from the trauma I had inflicted upon him. He told me to stay at the hotel for the foreseeable future, as my presence in the condo would only cause him further emotional distress and impede his physical healing. He ended the message by stating that Diane had already reorganized the kitchen pantry to better suit their dietary needs and that they would be expecting a grocery delivery on my account later that afternoon. I sat perfectly still in the hotel chair, my coffee growing cold beside me. He had not packed his bags. He had not retreated in humiliation. Instead, he had dug his heels in, invited his toxic mother to take up permanent residence in my home, and casually ordered me to stay away from my own property. I immediately typed back a firm, uncompromising response. I told him that the condo belonged exclusively to me, that Diane had absolutely no right to be on the premises, and that if they were not both gone by noon, I would have them removed for trespassing. I hit send, my heart pounding a steady, furious rhythm against my ribs. Less than a minute later, my phone chimed with his reply. It was a long, meticulously worded paragraph that sounded suspiciously like it had been drafted by a lawyer, rather than a luxury real estate agent. He smugly informed me that I could not just kick him out onto the street whenever I threw a temper tantrum. He pointed out that he had been living in the condo for well over a year. His mail was delivered to that address. His imported luxury vehicle was registered to that address. He had established clear legal residency. He proudly declared that under the city's tenant protection laws, he was legally considered a resident, regardless of whether his name was on the deed or whether he paid rent. He explicitly invoked squatters' and tenant rights, daring me to try and force him out. He clearly stated that if I wanted him and his mother to leave, I would have to go to the courthouse, file a formal 30-day eviction notice, and drag him through a lengthy, expensive legal process. Until a judge ordered him to vacate my condo, was legally his home too, and Diane was his authorized invited guest. He warned me that if I attempted to enter the property and remove his items, he would immediately call the police and have me arrested for illegal eviction and domestic violence, citing his injured knee as proof of my supposed physical abuse. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the sheer audacity of his threats settling heavily into my chest. He was not just a freeloader looking for a free place to stay. He was a calculated, manipulative predator who was fully prepared to weaponize the legal system against me. He had taken my perfectly justified act of self-defense and twisted it into a loaded gun aimed directly at my career. As a forensic accountant, my professional license and my entire business reputation relied heavily on a pristine personal record. A domestic violence charge, even a false one, would trigger an immediate investigation by the state licensing board. It would destroy my consulting firm and unravel everything I had built over the last decade. He knew this. He knew exactly where my vulnerabilities lay, and he was pressing on them with absolute precision. I could not afford to act on impulse. If I went back to my condo and demanded my property, I risked walking right into a trap that could end with me in handcuffs. I placed my phone face down on the heavy oak desk of my hotel room. I had to remain entirely professional and emotionally detached. I closed my eyes, took a long, stabilizing breath, and forced myself to pivot my attention back to my client accounts. I spent the next few hours burying myself in dense, complicated spreadsheets, seeking comfort in the absolute certainty of mathematics. Numbers did not lie. Numbers did not manipulate reality to suit their own agenda. But my temporary peace was violently shattered shortly after a quiet room service lunch. My phone began to vibrate violently against the wooden desk. It was not just one isolated notification. It was a continuous, relentless buzzing that signaled an absolute avalanche of incoming messages. I initially assumed it was Chase sending another wave of legal threats, or Diane texting me demands to pay their grocery bill. However, when I flipped the screen over, my stomach tightened with a sudden sinking dread. I was looking at a flood of notifications from various social media platforms. There were dozens of direct messages from mutual friends, angry comments tagging my name, and missed calls from people in our shared social circle who I had not spoken to in months. My pulse quickened as I unlocked the device. I tapped on a text message from a woman who was supposed to be one of my bridesmaids. Her message was incredibly brief and dripping with venom. It simply read that she was absolutely disgusted with me, that I needed serious psychiatric help, and that she was officially dropping out of the wedding party. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I opened my main social media feed to see what had triggered this sudden, aggressive hostility. Right at the very top of my timeline was a massive, highly public post from Chase. He had uploaded a carefully staged, brightly lit photograph of his right leg propped up on a pristine white pillow. His knee was encased in a thick, heavy medical brace, and an aluminum crutch was resting visibly against the side of my expensive linen sofa. The background clearly showed my living room, establishing his presence in my home. But the image itself was nothing compared to the caption beneath it. He had spun a masterful, deeply manipulative story that painted him as a selfless, suffering martyr and me as a dangerous, unhinged tyrant. He wrote a sprawling, tear-jerking paragraph about how difficult it is for men to speak up about domestic abuse and how shame had kept him silent for too long. He detailed a completely fabricated narrative in which I had been financially and emotionally controlling him for years, using my wealth to isolate him from his family and dictate his every waking move. The lies grew even more audacious and detailed as the post continued. He claimed that the mounting stress of the upcoming wedding had caused me to snap entirely. According to his entirely fictional account, I had flown into a sudden, unprovoked rage because he had gently suggested we spend less money on floral arrangements in order to save for our future family. He wrote that his elderly mother, Diane, had tried to step in and calmly de-escalate the situation, but I had immediately turned my irrational aggression toward her. In his twisted, cinematic version of events, he had valiantly stepped between me and his fragile mother to protect her from my wrath. He claimed that in return for his bravery, I had viciously and unexpectedly assaulted him. He described my defensive kick as a calculated, brutal attack that shattered his knee and left him in agonizing pain, unable to walk or work. He ended the post by asking for prayers and privacy while he and his mother huddled together in fear, trying to figure out how to safely escape the toxic, abusive environment I had trapped them in. I read the post with my hand covering my mouth, feeling physically nauseated by the sheer scale of his deception. He had crafted the absolute perfect narrative for his luxury real estate audience, leveraging his charismatic, charming persona to garner total sympathy. The comment section was already flooded with hundreds of replies. Clients, colleagues, and acquaintances were pouring in their support, praising his immense bravery for speaking out and offering their prayers for his swift recovery. But the messages directed at me were pure, unfiltered vitriol. People I had graciously hosted in my home, people who had eaten expensive dinners I had happily paid for, were openly calling me a monster. They called me a spoiled, arrogant rich girl who thought she could buy people and physically abuse them when they did not comply with her every demand. My phone continued to chime relentlessly with hateful direct messages. Another bridesmaid sent a text saying she was blocking my number. A senior colleague of Chase reached out just to call me a psychopath who deserved to be locked up. The public backlash was immediate, absolute, and utterly suffocating. I sat alone in my quiet hotel room watching my personal and social reputation burn to the ground in real time. Chase had successfully and surgically isolated me from our entire shared network in a matter of hours. He had completely flipped the script, ensuring that if I went to the police to report his attempted financial extortion or his physical intimidation, I would look exactly like the vindictive, wealthy abuser trying to punish her helpless victim. He had backed me into an incredibly tight, dangerous corner. I realized with a heavy, sinking certainty that I was entirely on my own. I could not rely on the court of public opinion, and I could not rely on the friends who had so easily and eagerly believed his charming lies without ever once asking for my side of the story. I let the heavy silence of the hotel room wrap around me as the profound reality of my isolation fully settled in. I could have broken down and cried. I could have recorded a frantic, tearful video trying to defend myself and explain what really happened in that kitchen. But the forensic accountant in me knew that engaging in a public emotional screaming match would only validate his claim that I was unstable. Fighting a charismatic professional liar with raw emotion was a guaranteed losing battle. I needed hard facts. I needed indisputable concrete evidence. I reached over to my phone, navigated to the settings, and calmly turned off every single social media notification. I silenced the incoming text messages and set my phone to forward all unknown calls directly to voicemail. I cut off the deafening noise of his smear campaign with a few deliberate, measured taps on the glass screen. The isolation was no longer a weapon he was using against me. It was a quiet fortress I was building for myself. I opened my laptop, cracked my knuckles, and stared at the glowing screen. If Chase wanted to play a high-stakes game using my home and my reputation as collateral, he was about to learn the hard way that he had picked a fight with a woman who dismantled carefully constructed illusions for a living. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, the audacity of his threat settling heavily into my chest. He was a manipulative predator, prepared to weaponize the legal system against me. He had taken my justified act of self-defense and twisted it into a loaded gun aimed at my career. A false domestic violence charge would trigger an immediate state licensing board investigation, destroying my forensic accounting firm and unraveling everything I had built. He knew exactly where my vulnerabilities lay, and he was pressing on them with precision. I could not afford to act on impulse. If I went back to my condo and demanded my property, I risked walking into a trap that could end with me in handcuffs. I placed my phone face down on the heavy oak desk of my hotel room. I had to remain professional and emotionally detached. I closed my eyes, took a stabilizing breath, and forced myself to pivot my attention back to my client accounts. I spent the next few hours burying myself in dense spreadsheets, seeking comfort in the absolute certainty of mathematics. Numbers did not lie. Numbers did not manipulate reality to suit their own agenda. But my temporary peace was violently shattered shortly after a quiet room service lunch. My phone began to vibrate against the wooden desk. The continuous, relentless buzzing signaled an avalanche of incoming messages. I initially assumed it was Chase sending another wave of legal threats, or Diane texting me demands to pay their grocery bill. When I flipped the screen over, my stomach tightened with a sudden dread. I stared at a flood of social media notifications. Dozens of direct messages from mutual friends, angry comments tagging my name, and missed calls from our shared social circle filled the screen. My pulse quickened as I unlocked the device. I tapped a text message from one of my bridesmaids. Her message was brief and dripping with venom. It simply read that she was absolutely disgusted with me, that I needed psychiatric help, and that she was officially dropping out of the wedding party. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I opened my main social media feed to see what had triggered this sudden hostility. At the top of my timeline was a massive, highly public post from Chase. He had uploaded a carefully staged, brightly lit photograph of his right leg propped up on a pristine white pillow. His knee was encased in a heavy medical brace, and an aluminum crutch rested visibly against the side of my expensive linen sofa. The background clearly showed my living room, establishing his presence in my home. The image itself was nothing compared to the caption beneath it. He had spun a masterful manipulative story that painted him as a selfless, suffering martyr, and me as a dangerous tyrant. He wrote a sprawling paragraph about how difficult it is for men to speak up about domestic abuse, and how shame had kept him silent for too long. He detailed a completely fabricated narrative in which I had been financially and emotionally controlling him for years, using my wealth to isolate him from his family and dictate his every move. The lies grew even more audacious as the post continued. He claimed that the mounting stress of the upcoming wedding had caused me to snap entirely. According to his fictional account, I flew into a sudden rage because he gently suggested we spend less on floral arrangements to save for our future family. He wrote that his elderly mother Diane had tried to step in and calmly de-escalate the situation, but I immediately turned my irrational aggression toward her. In his twisted version of events, he had valiantly stepped between me and his fragile mother to protect her from my wrath. He claimed that in return for his bravery, I had viciously assaulted him. He described my defensive kick as a calculated, brutal attack that shattered his knee and left him unable to walk. He ended the post by asking for prayers and privacy, while he and his mother huddled together in fear, trying to figure out how to safely escape the toxic environment I had trapped them in. I read the post with my hand covering my mouth, feeling physically nauseated by the sheer scale of his deception. He had crafted the perfect narrative for his luxury real estate audience, leveraging his charismatic persona to garner total sympathy. The comment section was already flooded with hundreds of replies. Clients, colleagues, and acquaintances were pouring in their support, praising his immense bravery for speaking out and offering prayers for his swift recovery. But the messages directed at me were pure, unfiltered vitriol. People I had graciously hosted in my home, people who had eaten expensive dinners I happily paid for, were openly calling me a monster. They called me a spoiled, arrogant rich girl who thought she could buy people and physically abuse them when they did not comply with her every demand. My phone continued to chime relentlessly with hateful direct messages. Another bridesmaid sent a text saying she was blocking my number. A senior colleague of Chase reached out just to call me a psychopath who deserved to be locked up. The public backlash was immediate, absolute, and utterly suffocating. I sat alone in my quiet hotel room watching my personal and social reputation burn to the ground in real time. Chase had successfully and surgically isolated me from our entire shared network in a matter of hours. He had completely flipped the script, ensuring that if I went to the police to report his attempted financial extortion or his physical intimidation, I would look exactly like the vindictive wealthy abuser trying to punish her helpless victim. He had backed me into an incredibly tight, dangerous corner. I realized with a heavy sinking certainty that I was entirely on my own. I could not rely on the court of public opinion, and I could not rely on the friends who had so easily believed his charming lies without ever once asking for my side of the story. The heavy silence of the hotel room wrapped around me as the profound reality of my isolation settled in. I could have broken down and cried. I could have recorded a frantic video trying to defend myself and explain what really happened in that kitchen. But the forensic accountant in me knew that engaging in a public emotional screaming match would only validate his claim that I was unstable. Fighting a charismatic professional liar with raw emotion was a guaranteed losing battle. I desperately needed hard facts. I needed indisputable concrete evidence. I reached over to my phone, navigated to the settings, and calmly turned off every single social media notification. I silenced the incoming text messages and set my phone to forward all unknown calls directly to voicemail. I cut off the deafening noise of his smear campaign with a few deliberate taps on the glass screen. The isolation was no longer a weapon he was using against me. It was a quiet fortress I was building for myself. I opened my laptop, cracked my knuckles, and stared at the glowing screen. If Chase wanted to play a high-stakes game using my home and reputation as collateral, he was about to learn the hard way that he had picked a fight with a woman who dismantled carefully constructed illusions for a living. The very next morning, I packed up my laptop and took a short cab ride over to the sleek glass building that housed the law firm of my closest friend and attorney, Roxanne. Roxanne was a powerful, unrelenting force in civil litigation who wore tailored suits like armor and approached every legal battle with the ruthless precision of a military general. I sat across from her massive mahogany desk, silently watching her sharp eyes scan the ridiculous lawsuit Chase had just had served to my hotel room. He was officially demanding $250,000 for assault, severe emotional distress, and loss of future income, or the deed to my condo. Roxanne let out a dry, humorless laugh and tossed the thick, ridiculous stack of papers onto her desk. She assured me that a judge would throw out his frivolous demands before lunch, but she warned me that the 30-day eviction notice we had just filed was going to be a grueling waiting game. Chase and Diane were legally dug in, and they were firmly banking on the arrogant assumption that mounting legal fees and public humiliation would eventually force me to surrender my home. I leaned back in the plush leather guest chair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I told Roxanne that I was not going to surrender a single inch of my property to those parasites. I was prepared to fight them in court for as long as it took. As Roxanne began outlining our strategy to depose Chase regarding his fabricated injuries, a sharp, piercing chime echoed from my laptop bag resting on the floor. It was a highly specific, customized alert tone I had programmed for my most secure financial accounts. My heart did a sudden, uncomfortable stutter in my chest. As a forensic accountant, I had layered my personal banking infrastructure with rigorous security protocols and multi-factor authentication steps that triggered an alarm the moment any significant activity occurred. I pulled out my phone, staring at the bright red notification illuminating the screen. It was a priority fraud alert from the financial institution holding the original mortgage on my condo. I immediately unlocked my phone and logged into my secure banking portal, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard. What I saw on the screen made the blood drain entirely from my face. My breathing hitched, and the quiet hum of the law office seemed to fade away into a muted buzz. Roxanne noticed my sudden pallor and sat forward, her professional demeanor instantly shifting into high alert. She asked me what was wrong, but I could not bring myself to speak right away. I was staring at a massive pending transaction that was actively processing through my property profile. Someone had initiated the final approval stages for a massive second mortgage on my condo, attempting to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars of my equity in a single unapproved cash withdrawal. Panic, sharp and visceral, flared in my chest, but I mercilessly shoved it down. I could not afford to panic. I grabbed my phone and immediately dialed the direct extension for my personal banker, a man I had worked with for nearly a decade. He answered on the second ring, recognizing my number. I did not bother with pleasantries. I demanded to know exactly what was happening with my property title and why a second mortgage was processing without my physical presence or verbal authorization. My banker sounded genuinely confused. He explained that a representative had physically walked into a branch office across town an hour ago to finalize the paperwork. The representative had presented a comprehensive, legally notarized power of attorney, granting them full, unrestricted rights to execute real estate and financial transactions on my behalf. I felt a cold sweat break out along the back of my neck. I told my banker in no uncertain terms that I had never granted power of attorney to anyone, let alone authorized a secondary loan against my home. I demanded that he halt the processing immediately, freeze every account tied to my social security number, and place a hard lockdown on my property deed. I could hear the frantic clicking of his keyboard through the speaker as he rushed to override the automated system and manually block the outgoing wire transfer. He confirmed that the funds had been stopped just in the nick of time. Had I waited another 30 minutes to check that alert, the cash would have been irreversibly cleared and sent out of my account forever. I let out a shaky breath, but the relief was entirely overshadowed by a burning, furious need for answers. I ordered my banker to send digital copies of every single document that had been submitted to the branch that morning. Less than 2 minutes later, a secure, encrypted file arrived in my email inbox. I opened the PDF on my laptop and spun the screen around so Roxanne could see. Staring back at us was a forged power of attorney. The document listed Chase as my designated financial proxy. It was signed with a terrifyingly accurate reproduction of my signature and bore the official stamp of a notary public. Chase had not just tried to embarrass me on social media or extort me with a flimsy civil lawsuit. He had crossed a massive, irredeemable line. He had committed a string of severe premeditated felonies in a desperate bid to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from my property. Roxanne leaned over the desk, her eyes scanning the forged signature and the fraudulent loan application. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The air grew incredibly heavy, thick with the realization of what this meant. Roxanne looked up at me, her expression dead serious, and stated that this completely changed the landscape of our fight. This was no longer a messy domestic dispute over a canceled wedding. This was no longer a squatter trying to hold on to a free apartment. This was severe, calculated financial fraud. Chase was staring down the barrel of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. The sheer audacity of his crime was breathtaking. He had truly believed that because I was currently isolated and hiding in a hotel room, he could quietly siphon my life savings out from under me before I ever noticed. I stared at the forged signature on the screen, my mind racing through a dozen different possibilities. The frantic, reckless nature of this crime did not align with the careful, image-obsessed luxury real estate agent I had known. Taking out a fraudulent second mortgage was an incredibly sloppy, high-risk maneuver that was virtually guaranteed to be discovered. It reeked of absolute blind desperation. Chase did not just want to punish me for ending our engagement. He genuinely, desperately needed an enormous amount of liquid cash, and he needed it right now. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to shift and rearrange themselves in my mind, forming a much darker, more dangerous picture. I knew that whatever hidden disaster he was running from it was going to be the absolute perfect weapon for my swift retaliation. I closed my laptop, the sharp snap echoing loudly in the quiet office space. I looked directly at Roxanne, feeling a cold, calculating determination finally settled deep into my bones. The bad breakup had officially evolved into a high-stakes financial thriller, and I was holding the magnifying glass. I sat in the quiet office, the hum of the city traffic outside feeling like a distant memory compared to the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Roxanne poured 2 cups of water from a heavy glass pitcher on her credenza and handed one to me. Her hand was steady, but her eyes were sharp with predatory focus. She told me we needed to pack up my laptop and go straight to the police with the forged power of attorney. She argued that we had concrete evidence of a federal crime and that a detective would gladly slap handcuffs on him by the end of the day. But my mind was already moving 10 steps ahead of a standard police report. Filing a report right now would tie this entire situation up in slow-moving local bureaucracy. Chase would immediately hire a slick defense attorney, claim it was a simple misunderstanding between an engaged couple managing shared assets, and drag the painful process out for months. I did not want him to have the luxury of time, and I certainly did not want him to have the opportunity to control the narrative. I wanted to completely dismantle him. I told Roxanne to sit back down and wait. I opened the encrypted file my banker had sent and navigated past the fraudulent signature pages. I scrolled directly to the detailed wire transfer authorization form Chase had submitted alongside the loan application. As a forensic accountant, I knew that white-collar criminals always leave a digital fingerprint, usually in the exact moment they try to move the stolen funds. I explained to Roxanne that we needed to look past the forgery itself and focus on the mechanics of his intended transaction. I zoomed in on the specific financial details of his request. He had applied to pull a massive line of credit against my property, but the initial immediate wire transfer he had attempted to push through today was for a highly specific amount. It was exactly $45,000. I stared at that number, letting the sheer audacity of it wash over me. It was the precise sum of money Diane had demanded from me in my kitchen just a few nights ago, claiming it was for a sudden, non-refundable catering and floral deposit. The absolute specificity of that number confirmed my deepest suspicions. The sudden wedding crisis was never real. There were no caterers demanding emergency midnight payments. There were no florists threatening to cancel our contract. It was an entirely fabricated emergency, a desperate cover story designed to extract a massive chunk of liquid cash from my bank account. When his physical intimidation tactics had failed to secure the money, he had panicked and escalated to felony forgery. But the burning question remained. Why did he need exactly $45,000 so urgently that he was willing to risk federal prison to get it? I focused my attention heavily on the destination field of the wire transfer form. If Chase was simply a greedy, opportunistic ex-fiancé trying to steal my money to enrich himself, he would have routed the approved loan funds directly into a personal checking account. He might have even tried to wire it to an offshore holding account or a secondary account registered in Diane's name to hide the trail. But the routing and account numbers listed on the bank form did not look right for a standard consumer checking account. The sequence of the digits indicated a much larger institutional holding. I opened a new secure tab on my internet browser and accessed a specialized commercial financial database I frequently used for my corporate consulting cases. I typed the 9-digit routing number from the fraudulent form into the search bar and hit enter. The screen loaded almost instantly, displaying the institutional details. The receiving bank was a highly prominent commercial institution located in the heart of the financial district in downtown Chicago, a bank that strictly dealt with corporate assets and business accounts, not personal retail banking. I highlighted the specific account number and cross-referenced it against public state business registries and real estate licensing databases. Roxanne watched me work in silence, knowing better than to interrupt my process when I was actively tracking a financial anomaly. The search results populated on my glowing screen, and I felt a sharp, triumphant thrill shoot through my veins. The destination account did not belong to Chase personally, and it certainly did not belong to Diane. It was registered to a corporate entity. Specifically, it was the primary client escrow account for the elite luxury real estate brokerage where Chase worked. Roxanne leaned over the polished surface of her desk, squinting at the glowing screen of my laptop. She read the name of the brokerage out loud, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She asked me why on earth a man would commit a federal felony just to wire $45,000 of stolen money directly into his employer's corporate bank account. It seemed entirely counterintuitive to the concept of theft. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face as I turned the laptop slightly so she could see the full breakdown of the account structure. I explained the fundamental, unbreakable rules of real estate finance to her. An escrow account is a heavily regulated, legally protected holding tank. When wealthy clients make an offer on a multi-million-dollar luxury home, they are required to deposit a massive amount of earnest money into that specific escrow account to prove to the seller that they are serious qualified buyers. That deposited money does not belong to the real estate brokerage, and it certainly does not belong to the individual real estate agent handling the sale. It is legally untouchable. It sits in that secure account until the home sale officially closes, at which point it is applied to the final purchase price. I looked Roxanne directly in the eyes, watching the realization begin to dawn on her sharp features. I told her that an agent never deposits their own personal funds into a client escrow account. The only logical reason an agent would be desperately trying to secretly dump cash back into that heavily monitored holding tank is if the money that was supposed to be there was suddenly missing. He was actively trying to cover a massive, glaring shortfall. Chase had been stealing earnest money from his own wealthy clients. He had been quietly siphoning their secure deposits out of the brokerage's escrow account to fund his luxurious, flashy lifestyle, his expensive imported car, and his mother's endless country club dues. The $45,000 he and Diane had so aggressively demanded from me was never intended to pay a wedding caterer or a florist. It was a frantic last-ditch effort to replace the stolen funds before anyone at the brokerage noticed the money was missing. I sat back in my chair, the picture coming into sharp, devastating focus. Chase was not just a manipulative partner trying to steal my condo. He was an active, desperate embezzler, teetering on the very edge of complete professional and legal ruin. The fake domestic abuse story, the squatter tactics, and the retaliatory lawsuit were all just smoke and mirrors, designed to distract me from his massive financial crimes. I closed my laptop with a definitive snap. I knew exactly what my next move had to be to push him over the edge. Roxanne reached for her phone, her eyes locked on the forged power of attorney glowing on my screen. She told me we had everything needed to ruin his life before dinner. She wanted to call a contact at the police department, hand over the documents, and have detectives knocking on my condo door with a warrant for wire fraud within the hour. It was a tempting thought. The image of Chase being hauled out in handcuffs sent a thrill of vindication through my chest. But my professional instincts overrode that desire for swift vengeance. Catching a criminal in the act of forgery was satisfying, but I knew the forgery was merely a symptom of a much larger disease. I placed my hand over the phone receiver, stopping Roxanne before she could dial. I told her to wait. If we called the police right now, local detectives would treat it as a messy domestic dispute. Chase would hire a slick defense attorney, claim it was a simple misunderstanding about wedding finances, and drag the legal process out for months. I did not want him to have the luxury of time or the opportunity to spin another charming narrative. I needed to see the entire financial board before making my next move. I pulled the laptop closer and opened the specific wire transfer authorization form Chase had submitted alongside the loan application. White-collar criminals always leave a digital fingerprint exactly when they try to move stolen funds. I zoomed in on the center of the document, highlighting the numerical value he had attempted to pull from my property equity. It was exactly $45,000. I let out a dry breath as the sheer audacity of that figure washed over me. It was the precise sum of money Diane had aggressively demanded from me in my kitchen just a few nights ago. She had screamed that it was an emergency non-refundable deposit required by our caterer and florist. The absolute exactness of that number confirmed my deepest suspicions. The sudden wedding crisis was never real. There were no caterers demanding midnight payments. There were no florists threatening to cancel our contract. It was an entirely fabricated emergency from start to finish. It was a desperate cover story designed to extract a massive chunk of liquid cash directly from my bank account. When physical intimidation failed to secure the money, he panicked and escalated to felony forgery. But the burning question remained. Why did he need exactly $45,000 so urgently that he was willing to risk federal prison to get it? I focused my attention heavily on the destination field of the wire transfer form. If Chase was simply an opportunistic ex-fiancé trying to steal my money, he would have routed the approved loan funds directly into a personal checking account. He might have even tried to wire it to an offshore holding account or a secondary account registered in Diane's name to hide the paper trail. But the routing and account numbers listed on the bank form did not look right for a standard consumer checking account. The sequence of the digits indicated a much larger institutional holding. I opened a secure tab on my internet browser and accessed a specialized commercial financial database I frequently used for corporate consulting cases. I carefully typed the 9-digit routing number from the fraudulent form into the search bar and hit enter. The screen populated with the institutional details in seconds. The receiving bank was a highly prominent commercial institution located in the heart of the financial district in downtown Chicago. It was a bank that strictly dealt with corporate assets, massive investment portfolios, and business accounts. They did not offer personal retail banking for individuals at all. I highlighted the specific account number provided on the transfer form and cross-referenced it against public state business registries and real estate licensing databases. Roxanne watched me work in total silence. She knew better than to interrupt my process when I was actively tracking a financial anomaly. Her eyes darted back and forth across the screen as corporate registrations rapidly scrolled past. The search results finally solidified on my glowing screen, and I felt a sharp, triumphant thrill shoot through my veins. The destination account did not belong to Chase personally, and it certainly did not belong to Diane. It was registered to a corporate entity. I read the name of the registered corporation out loud, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet office. It was the elite luxury real estate brokerage where Chase currently worked. But it was not just their general operating account. The database classified this specific account under a highly regulated category. It was the primary client escrow account for the entire brokerage firm. Roxanne leaned over her desk, squinting at my laptop screen. She read the name of the luxury brokerage out loud, again her brow furrowing in confusion. She asked why a man would commit a federal felony just to wire $45,000 of stolen money directly into his employer's corporate account. She pointed out that it seemed entirely counterintuitive to the concept of theft. You steal money to put it in your own pocket, not to give it to your boss. A slow, satisfied smile spread across my face as I turned the laptop so she could see the full breakdown of the account structure. I explained the fundamental rules of real estate finance to her. An escrow account is a heavily regulated, protected holding tank. When wealthy clients make an offer on a $1 million luxury home, they are required to deposit earnest money into that specific escrow account. This deposit proves to the seller that they are serious qualified buyers. That deposited money does not belong to the real estate brokerage, and it certainly does not belong to the individual real estate agent handling the sale. It is legally untouchable. It sits in that secure account until the home sale officially closes, at which point it is applied directly to the final purchase price. I looked Roxanne directly in the eyes, watching the realization dawn on her features. I told her that a real estate agent never deposits their own personal funds into a client escrow account. The only logical reason an agent would be desperately trying to secretly dump cash back into that heavily monitored holding tank is if the money that was supposed to be there was suddenly missing. He was actively trying to cover a massive shortfall. Chase had been stealing earnest money from his own wealthy clients. He had been quietly siphoning their secure deposits out of the brokerage's escrow account to fund his luxurious lifestyle, his imported sports car, and his mother's country club dues. The $45,000 he and Diane had so aggressively demanded from me was never intended to pay a wedding caterer or a florist. It was a frantic effort to replace the stolen funds before anyone at the brokerage noticed the money missing. I sat back, the picture coming into sharp focus. Chase was not just a manipulative partner trying to steal my condo. He was an active, desperate embezzler teetering on the very edge of complete professional and legal ruin. The fake abuse story, squatter tactics, and retaliatory lawsuit were just smoke and mirrors to distract me from his financial crimes. I closed my laptop with a definitive snap. I knew exactly what my next move had to be to push him over the edge. Roxanne sat across from me in stunned silence for a long moment before she let out a low, disbelieving whistle. She leaned back in her heavy leather chair and steepled her fingers together, her sharp eyes studying my face. She asked me if I was absolutely certain about what I was suggesting. I did not just suggest it. I knew it with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a professional who had spent a decade unraveling corporate theft. But knowing the truth and proving it with an airtight, undeniable paper trail were two very different things. I reached out and opened my laptop again, the bright screen illuminating the dark, polished surface of her desk. I told Roxanne that we were not going to the police today. If we handed them a single forged loan application, Chase would spin it as an isolated lapse in judgment caused by emotional distress. He would play the victim, beg for leniency, and probably walk away with probation. I wanted to hand the district attorney a fully assembled, undeniable criminal enterprise wrapped up with a neat little bow. I needed to map every single dollar he had stolen over the past 2 years, and I needed Roxanne to use her legal authority to pull the public records I could not access on my own. I did not hesitate to dive straight into the regional multiple listing service database, pulling up the complete transaction history for Chase and his luxury brokerage. I needed to see exactly how much money he was legitimately bringing in versus the lavish lifestyle he was constantly flaunting. Chase had always projected the image of a wildly successful elite real estate agent. He wore tailored designer suits, drove a high-end imported sports car, and bragged constantly about his multi-million-dollar listings. He had seamlessly integrated himself into the upper echelons of Chicago society, rubbing elbows with wealthy developers and corporate executives. But as I carefully downloaded and organized his transaction logs into a massive, heavily filtered spreadsheet, the glittering illusion he had so carefully crafted completely evaporated. I stared at the hard data populating the columns on my screen, feeling a cold, hollow sense of disbelief wash over me. According to the official closing records, Chase was not a top-producing agent. In fact, his performance was catastrophically poor. For the first year of our relationship, he had closed a handful of respectable deals enough to maintain a decent income. But when I isolated the data for the last 8 months, the columns representing his closed sales were entirely blank. He had not successfully finalized a single real estate transaction in almost a year. Every luxury listing he had represented during that time had either expired, been withdrawn from the market, or fallen through during the inspection and financing phases. His actual legitimate commission income for the past 8 months was exactly 0. I felt a sickening knot twist in my stomach as I cross-referenced his lack of income with my own personal memories. During those exact same 8 months, Chase had never once slowed down his spending. He had continued to take me to expensive 5-star restaurants, insisting on paying the bill with a flashy black credit card to prove his success. He had upgraded his leased sports car to a newer, more expensive model. He had proudly funded his mother's exorbitant country club membership and paid for her lavish weekend spa retreats. I had blindly believed he was thriving in his career, completely unaware that he was generating absolutely no income of his own. If he was not earning any commissions, there was only one place all that money could be coming from. He was actively bleeding his own clients dry. I instructed Roxanne to pull the property histories for every single luxury home Chase had placed under contract that eventually failed to close. As the legal documents flooded into my secure email inbox, I began to meticulously trace the timeline of the failed sales. When a buyer puts an offer on a high-end property, they write a massive check for earnest money to secure the deal. That money goes straight into the brokerage's escrow account. If the deal falls through, the money is supposed to be safely returned to the buyer. I tracked the dates when Chase's wealthy clients had deposited their earnest money. Then I cross-referenced those specific dates with the timeline of Chase and Diane's most extravagant purchases. The correlation was not just suspicious, it was a perfectly synchronized, undeniable pattern of theft. 2 days after a client deposited $60,000 for a downtown penthouse that never closed, Chase had signed the paperwork for his brand new luxury car lease, putting down a massive cash deposit. 3 days after another client wired $80,000 for a suburban mansion, Diane had suddenly paid off a massive lingering debt at her exclusive country club. Chase was treating the highly regulated client escrow account like his own personal limitless piggy bank. He was running a miniature Ponzi scheme within his own brokerage. When a deal inevitably fell through and a client demanded their earnest money back, Chase would simply delay the refund, blaming banking errors or administrative red tape, until he could convince a new client to put down a deposit on a different house. He would then use the new stolen money to pay back the old stolen money, keeping the terrifying cycle going while constantly skimming thousands of dollars off the top for himself and his mother. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. I needed to see exactly how Diane was receiving her cut of the stolen funds. She was far too calculated to just let Chase hand her large stacks of illicit cash. I had Roxanne run a deep background check on Diane's financial history and business registrations. Within minutes, Roxanne uncovered a shell company registered under Diane's maiden name. It was vaguely listed as an interior design and staging consulting firm. I dug into the transaction logs attached to the properties Chase had failed to close. Sure enough, buried in the preliminary vendor invoices, there were massive, exorbitant fees billed to Diane's fake consulting firm for staging services that were never actually rendered. Chase was systematically approving fraudulent invoices to authorize the release of escrow funds directly into his mother's checking account. Diane was not just a passive beneficiary of her son's crimes. She was an active, willing, and greedy co-conspirator. I sat back in my chair, the sheer magnitude of their criminal enterprise pressing heavily against my chest. I had spent the last 2 years sharing my home, my life, and my heart with a man who was nothing more than a desperate, calculating fraud. He had looked me in the eyes and promised me a beautiful future while actively orchestrating a massive financial conspiracy just out of sight. The $45,000 they had tried to extort from me in my kitchen was just a tiny drop in a massive ocean of stolen money. Based on my preliminary calculations, Chase and Diane had siphoned well over $300,000 from unsuspecting clients over the last 8 months alone. The emotional betrayal was staggering, but I refused to let it break me. Instead, I channeled every ounce of my shock and disgust into cold, ruthless productivity. I spent the rest of the afternoon building a comprehensive, undeniable forensic audit report. I compiled every forged document, every failed property listing, every suspicious date, and every fraudulent invoice tied to Diane's shell company. I organized the evidence into clear, meticulously labeled charts and graphs that even a rookie detective could understand. I was no longer the heartbroken fiancé trying to escape a toxic relationship. I was a professional executioner preparing to deliver a fatal blow. By the time the sun began to set over the Chicago skyline, casting long, dark shadows across Roxanne's office, I had compiled a masterpiece of financial destruction. Chase and Diane thought they could steal my money and destroy my reputation without consequence. They were about to learn that they had targeted the one woman capable of tearing their entire lives apart, down to the very last stolen cent. Before I executed that move, however, I needed to uncover the exact catalyst for his sudden, reckless desperation. The puzzle of his embezzlement was devastatingly clear, but the timeline of his panic still bothered me. Why this specific week? Why not a month ago or 2 months from now? Embezzlers operating a slow, continuous siphon-like chase rarely panic unless an external force threatens to expose their entire operation. He had been comfortably stealing earnest money for 8 solid months without raising any internal alarms at his brokerage. He had mastered the art of delaying refunds and shuffling funds between accounts to keep the illusion alive. Something massive and unyielding was rapidly approaching, and it had spooked him so badly that he was willing to physically intimidate me and commit felony forgery just to secure a $45,000 cash infusion. I turned my attention completely away from the localized property records and quickly opened a completely new search portal, directly shifting my focus toward the state government level. I knew from my years of forensic corporate consulting that real estate brokerages, particularly those handling multi-million-dollar luxury properties and massive escrow accounts, are heavily regulated by state licensing boards. They are required to undergo rigorous periodic financial compliance checks to ensure that client funds are safely separated from general operating expenses. I carefully navigated directly to the official website portal for the State Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. The interface was clunky and outdated, but the public records were entirely accessible if you knew exactly what to look for. I efficiently bypassed the standard agent licensing searches and dug incredibly deep into the administrative compliance calendars. I carefully filtered the upcoming regulatory schedules by region, then by brokerage size, and finally by the specific corporate identification number attached to Chase's luxury firm. I slowly scrolled past routine continuing education seminars and standard licensing renewal deadlines until a specific highly prioritized compliance notification caught my eye. The State Regulatory Board had officially scheduled a comprehensive mandatory financial audit for Chase's exact brokerage branch. The formal notification had been issued to the managing partners just 10 days ago, legally mandating that they surrender all financial records, including full unrestricted access to their client escrow accounts, for a thorough state inspection. The date of the impending audit was set for the very end of the current month. That specific deadline was less than 2 weeks away. I sat completely frozen in my chair as the profound reality of that calendar date hit me. State auditors definitely do not just glance at simple bottom-line balances. They rigorously track every single penny that enters and exits an escrow account. They verify the earnest money deposits against the active, canceled, and closed property contracts. The very first thing those seasoned government auditors would notice was a glaring, inexplicable $45,000 shortfall linked directly to Chase's failed property listings. The entire carefully constructed illusion was about to come violently crashing down on his head. The moment the state regulators discovered the missing funds, they would freeze the brokerage's accounts and launch a full criminal investigation. Chase would be instantly stripped of his real estate license. His managing partners would throw him entirely to the wolves to save their own firm, and the district attorney would gladly pursue federal wire fraud charges. He was staring down the barrel of a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary. The timeline aligned with absolutely terrifying precision. 10 days ago, the brokerage partners received the audit notice and undoubtedly informed their agents to ensure all client files were in perfect order. That was the exact terrifying moment the countdown clock started ticking for Chase. He had barely 10 days to quietly replace the stolen escrow money before the auditors arrived and sealed his fate. The sudden, chaotic, emotional crisis in my kitchen suddenly made absolute, perfect, terrifying sense. The wedding catering emergency was a complete, desperate fabrication from start to finish. There was absolutely no missing floral deposit whatsoever. There was definitely no aggressive vendor demanding after-hours wire transfers. Diane and Chase had concocted the entire scenario in a frantic, last-ditch effort to extract the exact amount of money needed to balance his compromised escrow ledger. They knew I had liquid capital easily accessible in my personal accounts. They knew I was deeply emotionally invested in the wedding. They gambled heavily on the assumption that I would blindly hand over my bank card to keep the peace and ensure our special day went off without a hitch. When I calmly demanded itemized invoices and refused to be financially bullied, their entire survival plan evaporated in an instant. His highly violent outburst, the raised fist, and the unhinged screaming were not just the actions of a frustrated partner. They were the visceral, entirely uncontrolled reactions of a desperate, cornered animal, realizing the trap was about to spring shut. When his physical intimidation failed to break me, his desperation mutated into absolute recklessness. He suddenly realized he could not smoothly manipulate the cash out of my hands, so he attempted to steal it through felony forgery, betting his freedom on a fraudulent second mortgage application. He was a man drowning in his own deceit, wildly grabbing at my property and my life savings to use as a makeshift life raft. And his mother, Diane, was standing right there beside him, aggressively cheering him on, fully willing to let me take the financial fall so her precious son could avoid wearing a prison jumpsuit. I stared at the state audit notification on my laptop screen, feeling a cold, heavy truth settle deep into my chest. I had foolishly spent 2 years of my life truly loving a man who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient, high-yielding insurance policy. Every compliment, every romantic dinner, every discussion about our future children had been a calculated investment on his part. He did not love me. He loved the financial security my career provided, and he loved having a wealthy, independent partner he could eventually bleed dry when his own fraudulent lifestyle inevitably caught up with him. The betrayal was incredibly deep, an agonizing realization that the foundation of our entire relationship was constructed on a massive predatory lie. But I definitely did not let the heartbreak consume me. The profound disgust I felt for him and his mother completely overpowered any lingering trace of sadness. I slowly exhaled, letting the chilled, conditioned air of Roxanne's law office fill my lungs. The frantic, confusing chaos of the past few days had been completely replaced by absolute crystal-clear certainty. Chase and Diane had severely miscalculated every single aspect of this entire situation. They thought my working-class background made me entirely naive. They thought my love for Chase made me blind and compliant. They truly believed they could orchestrate a massive financial crime, falsely accuse me of domestic abuse, hold my condo hostage, and walk away completely unscathed. But they had handed me the exact weapon I needed to ensure their total destruction. I did not just have undeniable evidence of their past thefts. I held the precise ticking timeline of their impending doom. The state auditors were coming, and I was going to make absolutely certain that they found exactly what they were looking for. I turned to Roxanne, a calm, lethal energy settling deeply into my voice. It was time to bait the final trap. Roxanne stared across her wide mahogany desk, her sharp eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation or lingering emotional fragility. She leaned back in her heavy leather chair, drumming her manicured fingers against the polished armrest while processing the sheer magnitude of what I had just proposed. She reminded me that we were currently sitting on a mountain of undeniable hard evidence that could immediately trigger a federal indictment and put him behind bars. She cautioned that deliberately delaying a formal report to law enforcement in order to orchestrate a personal confrontation carried severe inherent risks. If Chase somehow realized we knew about the missing escrow funds, he might attempt to flee the jurisdiction, drain his remaining accounts, or systematically destroy crucial brokerage records before the state auditors ever arrived. I listened to her professional warnings with absolute calm, absorbing her legal perspective without letting it sway my ultimate decision. I closed the thick file folder containing the fraudulent loan documents and rested my hands flat on top of it, feeling the weight of my meticulous research. I told Roxanne that I fully understood the risks involved, but I was simply not willing to settle for a quiet, bureaucratic resolution to this profound betrayal. If we simply handed this detailed financial audit over to a local detective on a random Tuesday afternoon, Chase would be discreetly arrested at his apartment or his luxury office. He would immediately post-bail hire a charismatic, high-priced defense attorney and spend the next 2 years manipulating the narrative to secure public sympathy. I explained to Roxanne that Chase was an absolute master of psychological deflection. He would undoubtedly spin a complex, tear-jerking story claiming that he was merely the unfortunate victim of a massive administrative error at his brokerage. He would use his mother Diane to publicly testify about his supposed strong moral character and his dedication to his clients. Furthermore, he would inevitably insinuate that I had used my forensic accounting expertise to somehow frame him out of bitter, vindictive jealousy over our canceled wedding. He had already proven exactly how effectively he could turn our entire shared social circle against me with a single, heavily fabricated social media post. I refused to let him maintain even a shred of his carefully cultivated reputation. I wanted to expose his criminal enterprise in a manner so spectacularly public and undeniable that no amount of charming smiles or manipulative lies could ever save him from the fallout. To achieve that level of absolute destruction, I needed to corner him in a highly visible setting where his wealthy clients and professional peers would witness his downfall firsthand. But to successfully lure him into that specific inescapable vulnerability, we had to stroke his massive, fragile ego. We needed to make him feel utterly invincible and completely in control of the situation. We had to convince him that his vicious campaign of digital isolation and physical intimidation had worked perfectly successfully, breaking my spirit and forcing me into a desperate, unconditional submission. Roxanne leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk as a slow, predatory smile replaced her previous legal caution. She asked exactly how I wanted to bait the hook to ensure he took the deal without asking questions. I instructed her to reach out directly to the civil defense attorney Chase had hired to file his absurd retaliatory lawsuit against me. I needed her to deliver a highly calculated, award-winning performance over the phone. I told Roxanne to portray herself as a deeply concerned legal counsel who was desperately trying to mitigate the severe emotional damage being inflicted upon her wealthy, fragile client. She needed to explicitly communicate that the relentless digital smear campaign was taking a catastrophic toll on my mental health and my ability to run my consulting firm. She was going to tell his lawyer that the hateful messages from my former friends, the threatening voicemails, and the intense social isolation had completely compromised my ability to function normally. I wanted Chase to firmly believe that I was absolutely terrified of a lengthy, highly publicized court battle that would further drag my professional name and my business through the mud. The narrative we were constructing painted me as a weak, exhausted woman who was willing to do practically anything just to make the relentless harassment and public humiliation stop immediately. It was the exact, vulnerable, submissive persona he and Diane had always secretly believed I possessed, making the lie incredibly easy for their arrogant minds to swallow. We were going to offer him exactly what he had aggressively demanded in my kitchen, a clean, quiet, and highly lucrative private settlement that would magically solve all his problems. I outlined the specific terms of our fake surrender to Roxanne. We would propose handing over a certified cashier's check for the exact sum of $45,000. This was the precise amount he so desperately needed to secretly replace the stolen earnest money before the state regulatory auditors descended upon his brokerage at the end of the month. In exchange for this immediate infusion of liquid cash, he would formally agree to drop his frivolous assault lawsuit, permanently vacate my condominium by the end of the week, and publicly retract the fabricated domestic abuse allegations he had posted on his social media accounts. Roxanne picked up her office telephone, her eyes sparkling with ruthless anticipation, and dialed the direct line for Chase's legal counsel. I sat perfectly still in the plush guest chair, listening closely as she flawlessly executed the exact script we had just designed. Her tone was appropriately tense and conciliatory, perfectly mimicking a seasoned lawyer trying to broker an emergency peace treaty for a client who was falling apart behind closed doors. She heavily emphasized my supposed desperation to resolve the matter privately and quickly, dangling the highly alluring promise of immediate unbothered cash to secure his absolute compliance. After delivering the settlement proposal, Roxanne placed the call on mute, and we waited in the quiet office for the response. I knew that Chase was far too greedy and far too desperate to reject an offer that miraculously solved his impending federal audit crisis. He was a man drowning in a dark, stormy ocean of his own deceit, and we had just tossed him what looked exactly like a golden life preserver. Less than 30 minutes later, Roxanne's office telephone rang sharply, shattering the silence in the room. It was Chase's attorney calling back with an enthusiastic, immediate confirmation. The lawyer proudly reported that his client was willing to be magnanimous and accept the financial settlement in the spirit of moving forward and finding closure. Chase, completely blinded by his own staggering arrogance and his desperate clawing need to secure the missing escrow funds, had swallowed our bait whole without a single second of hesitation or suspicion. He truly believed he had beaten me into submission. He honestly thought his campaign of psychological terror had successfully forced me to surrender my money to save my reputation. The lawyer informed Roxanne that Chase wanted to formalize the agreement as soon as possible. He was so eager to get his hands on the $45,000 check that he insisted on executing the final signatures in person. I looked at Roxanne and offered a cold, deeply satisfied nod. The trap was fully set, and the arrogant prey was eagerly marching directly toward the center of the cage. The following week moved slowly as Roxanne and I finalized every single detail of our strategy. Chase and his attorney sent over a list of demands for the settlement meeting. True to his arrogant nature, Chase completely rejected signing the paperwork in a quiet conference room or a neutral legal office. Instead, he insisted the exchange take place on a Friday evening at the grand ballroom of a historic Chicago hotel. This was the venue for the annual real estate charity gala hosted by his very own brokerage firm. The entire event was a massive, highly publicized spectacle meant to showcase the wealth and success of the top agents. The guest list included powerful property developers, wealthy investors, and politicians. Chase chose this specific venue because he thought it gave him the ultimate psychological advantage. He and Diane firmly believed that if we met in the middle of Chicago high society, I would be too intimidated to cause any disruption. They assumed my background would make me feel small and out of place among the elite. They calculated that I would quietly hand over the check, sign the settlement papers in a private room just off the main hall, and slip out the back door to avoid making a scene. It was a manipulation tactic designed to force me into a submissive corner. Roxanne had advised against attending such a chaotic and uncontrolled event. She worried the crowded environment might complicate our plans. But I told her the venue was perfect for what we needed to accomplish. I wanted his partners and his clients to be in the building when his world fell apart. The days leading up to the gala were spent organizing the audit report. I printed copies of the financial records, the forged loan documents, and the spreadsheets tracking the stolen earnest money. I placed them into heavy professional binders. Every page was a nail in his coffin. I felt no anxiety or fear as the weekend approached. I only felt a steady calm. I was prepared to walk into his territory and dismantle his life. When Friday evening arrived, the weather in Chicago was crisp and clear. The streets were bustling with evening traffic, and the bright lights of the city reflected off the river. I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel suite and inspected my reflection. If Chase and Diane expected to see an exhausted woman beaten down by their digital smear campaign, they were going to be severely disappointed. I chose my outfit with the precision of a soldier selecting armor for battle. I wore a tailored, deep emerald green evening gown that fit me perfectly. It was elegant, striking, and projected an air of absolute, unbothered power. I paired it with black heels and expensive jewelry I purchased from the profits of my successful consulting firm. I pulled my hair back into a sharp style and applied my makeup flawlessly. I looked completely untouched by the chaos they had tried to inflict upon my life. I looked like a woman who was in total control of her destiny. Roxanne arrived at my hotel suite shortly after 7. She dressed in a sharp black suit and carried a leather briefcase that held the thick audit binders. She looked me up and down and gave an approving nod. We walked out of the hotel and stepped into the waiting town car without saying a word. The ride to the hotel took less than 15 minutes. but the anticipation building in my chest made it feel much longer. The grand ballroom of the hotel was magnificent. As we stepped through the ornate brass doors, the sound of a live jazz band and the low murmur of hundreds of conversations washed over us. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the massive room. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd with trays of champagne and expensive appetizers. The room was packed with the people Chase spent his life trying to impress. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my chin held high as Roxanne and I navigated our way through the sea of designer dresses and tailored tuxedos. I did not rush. I took my time letting my presence be known. A few people from our shared social circle spotted me as I walked past their tables. I saw their eyes go wide with shock. They had read the vicious lies Chase posted on social media. They fully expected me to be hiding in shame. Instead, I offered them a calm smile and kept walking completely unfazed by their staring. It did not take long to spot Chase and Diane. They stood near the center of the room holding court with a group of older real estate investors. Chase wore a brand new tuxedo that he undoubtedly purchased with stolen escrow money. He had a glass of scotch in one hand and was laughing loudly at a joke someone made. He was leaning heavily on a sleek black medical cane, playing the role of the brave, injured victim to absolute perfection. Diane stood beside him, draped in a flashy silver gown, soaking up the attention and sympathy of the crowd. They looked incredibly arrogant. They looked like people who truly believed they had won the game. They had absolutely no idea their entire reality was about to shatter into a million pieces. I stopped a few yards away and simply watched them for a moment. I watched the man who had raised his fist to me in my own kitchen pretend to be a charming gentleman. I watched the woman who had demanded my bank card play the role of a loving, supportive mother. The sheer hypocrisy of their performance would have made me sick just a few weeks ago. Now it only fueled my determination. Roxanne leaned close to my ear and whispered that the lawyer representing Chase had sent her a text message. The lawyer was waiting for us in the private room located just down the hall from the main ballroom. I gave Roxanne a slight nod. I took one last look at Chase, watching him smile for a photographer who was snapping pictures for a local magazine. He was enjoying his final moments of freedom and prestige. I turned away from the crowded ballroom and walked smoothly down the quiet carpeted hallway toward the private meeting room. The heavy wooden doors stood closed at the end of the corridor. Behind those doors, Chase and Diane were expecting me to hand over a $45,000 check and surrender my dignity. I reached out, grasped the metal of the door handle, and prepared to deliver the audit that would end their lives. The heavy brass hinges offered no resistance as I pushed the door inward and stepped across the threshold. It was explicitly designed for high-stakes corporate negotiations. It featured dark mahogany paneled walls and a polished boardroom table dominating the center of the room. The air felt still and stifling, thick with expensive cologne and palpable arrogance. Chase sat at the far end of the long table, leaning back in a plush leather executive chair, with his injured leg propped up on a padded footrest. The sleek black medical cane rested prominently against the edge of the table, a calculated prop designed to remind everyone of his supposed suffering. His defense attorney sat quietly to his right, organizing a neat stack of legal documents. Diane was positioned a few feet away, lounging on a tufted velvet sofa. She held a crystal flute of champagne and watched my entrance with an expression of absolute triumph. Roxanne walked in right beside me, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She simply pulled out a chair for me near the center of the table and took the seat immediately to my left, placing her heavy leather briefcase squarely on the polished wood. I sat down gracefully, smoothing the fabric of my emerald green gown, and folded my hands together in my lap. I looked directly at Chase. He wore a smug, deeply satisfied smirk that completely failed to hide the frantic, hungry desperation burning behind his eyes. He thought he had successfully broken me. He fully believed that the woman sitting across from him was thoroughly exhausted, terrified of public ruin, and desperate to buy her way out of a nightmare. He did not waste any time with pleasantries. The moment I settled into my chair, he reached out and slid a thick manila folder across the smooth surface of the table. It came to a stop just inches from my hands. Chase leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He adopted a tone of magnanimous forgiveness, speaking to me as if he were a benevolent king, sparing a treacherous peasant. He announced that the folder contained the binding settlement agreements his lawyer had drawn up yesterday. He stated that the moment I handed over the certified cashier's check for exactly $45,000, he would formally instruct his legal counsel to drop the frivolous civil lawsuit regarding his fabricated assault injuries. He also promised to officially renounce his squatter's rights, confirming that he and his mother would permanently vacate my downtown condominium by the end of the upcoming weekend. He added that he would graciously delete the defamatory social media posts he had orchestrated, provided I agreed to a strict, permanent non-disparagement clause. He wanted to legally gag me, ensuring I could never speak a single word about his violent outburst in my kitchen or his desperate attempt to extort money. He tapped his index finger against the top of the manila folder and demanded that I hand over the check immediately so we could finalize the paperwork. He told me that this was the absolute best deal I was ever going to get. He claimed he was doing me a massive favor by letting me walk away without a permanent criminal record or a completely destroyed professional reputation. He said it was a shame things had to end this way, but that my incredibly selfish behavior had left him with absolutely no other choice but to protect himself and his mother. I listened to his entire speech without blinking, maintaining a mask of absolute unbothered calm. I did not reach for the folder or my bag. I just sat there and let the heavy silence stretch out, allowing his arrogant words to hang awkwardly in the quiet space. Before his attorney could prompt me to sign, Diane decided she could no longer contain her overwhelming sense of victory. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne. She let out a loud, mocking sigh and adjusted her flashy silver gown. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Diane loudly declared that this entire humiliating situation was exactly what happened when a successful man tried to elevate a woman who lacked proper breeding. She spoke directly to Chase's attorney, making sure her voice echoed clearly across the room, so I would hear every single venomous word. She sneered that my working-class roots had always been a massive, embarrassing problem for their family. She claimed that people who grew up without real wealth never truly learned how to behave with grace or respect for their betters. Diane proclaimed that handing over the settlement money was the least I could do to compensate Chase for putting up with my miserable attitude for the past 2 years. She said it was finally time to put the arrogant working-class girl in her place once and for all. She gloated about how thoroughly they had exposed my true nature to all our mutual friends. She laughed about the hateful messages I had been receiving, stating that my complete social isolation was a fitting punishment for daring to disrespect her son. She went on to boast about my condominium, casually mentioning how much she had enjoyed redecorating my kitchen over the past week while I was hiding in a cheap hotel room. She talked about my home and my hard-earned money as if they were her own personal assets. Her arrogance was breathtaking, but it only fueled the cold determination anchoring my posture. I let her finish without offering a single word of interruption. Roxanne sat perfectly still beside me, her expression a masterclass in professional restraint. She knew exactly what was inside the heavy leather briefcase resting on the table, and she was simply waiting for my signal to unleash absolute devastation. I looked back at Chase. The smug smile on his face had widened significantly while his mother berated me. He nodded along with her insults, entirely convinced that my silence was a clear sign of total defeat. He tapped the manila folder one more time, his voice dripping with impatient greed. He told me to stop stalling and pull out the check. He said the gala was waiting for him outside, and he wanted to go celebrate his victory with his wealthy clients and brokerage partners. He demanded the money, fully believing he had backed me into a corner from which I could never escape. I looked at the manila folder containing his pathetic settlement demands, and then I slowly turned my gaze back to his expectant face. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the absolute power of the moment settle into my veins. I reached down toward Roxanne's heavy leather briefcase, ready to introduce them to the real consequences of their actions. I kept my eyes locked on Chase as I reached down and rested my hand on the smooth brass latches of Roxanne's leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the tense silence of the VIP room, cutting right through the faint sound of the jazz band playing out in the main ballroom. I did not reach for my checkbook. I did not reach for a pen to sign his absurd extortion papers. Instead, I reached into the deep pocket of the briefcase and pulled out a massive, heavily bound document. It was over 200 pages thick, secured with a heavy-duty black binding spine and meticulously organized with dozens of color-coded index tabs. I lifted it with both hands and let it drop squarely onto the polished mahogany table. The heavy, authoritative thud of the binder landing directly on top of his flimsy manila settlement folder made Chase physically flinch. He stared at the thick document, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. The smug, victorious smirk that had been plastered across his face just seconds ago began to falter. He looked over at his defense attorney, expecting some sort of explanation, but the lawyer was equally perplexed, leaning forward to get a better look at the cover page. Diane let out a sharp, impatient huff from her spot on the velvet sofa. She aggressively demanded to know what kind of ridiculous stalling tactic this was. She reminded me that her son had wealthy, important clients waiting for him out in the ballroom, and that I needed to stop wasting their precious time with useless paperwork. I ignored her completely. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on the man who thought he could destroy me. I told Chase that I was not going to sign a single page of his settlement agreement. I informed him, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion, that he was never going to see a single cent of my money, and he was absolutely never going to step foot inside my condominium again. Chase's face flushed with a sudden, violent anger. He gripped the arms of his executive chair and leaned forward, dropping the charming facade entirely. He snarled that I was making a massive mistake. He threatened to call the police right now and have me arrested for assault. He warned me that if I walked out of this room without paying him, he would make sure my professional reputation in Chicago was completely annihilated by tomorrow morning. I did not react to his threats. I simply reached out and placed my hand flat on the cover of the thick binder. I told him that my professional reputation was exactly what had brought us to this table tonight. I instructed him to open the binder. When he hesitated, glaring at me with raw hostility, Roxanne leaned forward and echoed the command. She told his attorney that it would be in his client's absolute best interest to review the opposing counsel's discovery packet before making any further demands. The defense attorney nervously nodded and slid the heavy binder across the table until it rested directly in front of Chase. With a heavy, irritated sigh, Chase flipped open the black cover. He fully expected to see a countersuit, perhaps a collection of character witness statements, or an itemized list of damages regarding the condo. Instead, his eyes fell upon a highly complex, flawlessly structured financial spreadsheet. The very first page was a master ledger detailing the exact routing numbers, transaction dates, and final destination accounts for every single real estate deal he had touched over the past 2 years. I did not wait for him to process the numbers on his own. I began to read the data aloud from memory, my voice cutting through the stuffy air of the boardroom with lethal precision. I started by highlighting his catastrophic sales record. I stated clearly, ensuring his attorney heard every word, that Chase had not successfully closed a single luxury home sale in exactly 8 months. I listed the specific addresses of the multi-million-dollar properties he had placed under contract that had subsequently failed to clear inspections or financing. I watched his eyes dart rapidly across the spreadsheet as he desperately tried to comprehend how I had obtained such heavily guarded professional data. I then directed his attention to the second tab of the audit. I calmly read off the exact dates and dollar amounts of the earnest money deposits his wealthy clients had wired into the brokerage's secure escrow account. I followed those figures immediately with the dates of his most extravagant personal purchases. I noted the $60,000 deposit that miraculously coincided with the massive down payment on his newly leased imported sports car. I highlighted the $80,000 deposit that perfectly matched the timeline of Diane paying off her supposedly insurmountable country club debt. The color began to rapidly drain from Chase's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The arrogant posturing man from 5 minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a terrified criminal realizing the walls were closing in. He tried to speak, tried to form a coherent denial, but his mouth just opened and closed without making a sound. His defense attorney, realizing the severe criminal implications of the spreadsheet, went completely rigid in his chair. I did not stop. I relentlessly continued flipping through the pages of his destruction. I moved on to the third section of the audit, which explicitly detailed the upcoming mandatory state regulatory compliance check. I told him that I knew all about the state auditors arriving at his brokerage at the end of the month. I looked him dead in the eye and stated that the $45,000 catering crisis was nothing but a pathetic, desperate lie designed to extort the exact amount of cash he needed to replace the stolen earnest money before the government regulators discovered his massive shortfall and sent him to a federal penitentiary. Diane, who had been sitting quietly on the sofa trying to follow the complex financial terminology, suddenly realized the grave danger her son was in. She stood up abruptly, her silver gown rustling loudly in the quiet room. She pointed a trembling finger at me and shrieked that I was a liar. She aggressively claimed that I had fabricated the entire document out of sheer vindictive jealousy because Chase had realized I was not good enough for their family. I slowly turned my head to look at her, offering a cold, merciless smile. I told Diane that she should probably sit back down because the fourth and final section of the audit report was dedicated entirely to her. I instructed Chase to turn to the pink index tab near the back of the binder. I clearly detailed the discovery of the fraudulent shell company registered under Diane's maiden name. I read aloud the exorbitant, completely fabricated invoices billed to that fake staging and design firm. I explained step by step exactly how Chase had systematically approved those fraudulent vendor invoices to authorize the illegal release of client escrow funds directly into his mother's personal checking account. I made it absolutely clear to everyone in the room that Diane was not just an innocent bystander or a clueless beneficiary. She was a fully complicit active co-conspirator in a massive federal wire fraud and embezzlement ring. Diane let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the plush carpet with a dull, wet thud as expensive alcohol spilled across the floor. She collapsed back onto the velvet sofa, her hands covering her face in absolute horror. The defense attorney immediately pushed his chair away from the table, physically distancing himself from his client. He stammered that he could not represent Chase in matters regarding active federal felonies and rapidly began packing up his briefcase. Chase sat entirely paralyzed in his executive chair. He stared down at the heavily bound forensic audit report, his breathing shallow and rapid. His hands shook violently as they rested on the polished mahogany table. The devastating reality of his situation had finally crushed his massive ego. He had been completely and perfectly documented. Every stolen cent, every forged signature, and every desperate lie had been meticulously mapped out by the woman he thought he could effortlessly manipulate and destroy. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft dripping of spilled champagne seeping into the carpet. Diane sat frozen on the velvet sofa, her hands covering her face, unable to look at the damning evidence. Chase remained entirely motionless, staring blankly at the open binder. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as the magnitude of his failure paralyzed him. He had relied on his charm to talk his way out of consequence, but there were no words left to save him from the mathematics of his crimes. I sat calmly across from him, feeling no pity. I raised my left arm and pulled back the sleeve of my emerald green gown. I glanced down at my silver wristwatch, watching the second hand sweep in a continuous circle. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. The timing was absolutely perfect. I lowered my arm and folded my hands back into my lap, leaning forward to ensure I had his complete attention. I spoke softly, my voice carrying a cold authority that forced him to look up. I told him I did not spend an entire week compiling a forensic audit just to force an apology. I certainly did not bring this massive binder to his charity gala to negotiate a settlement or ask for my ring back. I wanted him to understand the document resting on the mahogany table was merely a courtesy copy. I watched his brow furrow as my words penetrated his panicked mind. I explained that exactly 48 hours ago, I securely transmitted the original fully authenticated digital files directly to the lead investigator at the State Real Estate Licensing Board. I told him I had also hand-delivered a printed copy of the financial breakdown complete with every forged signature and fraudulent invoice directly to the white-collar crime division of the district attorney. I let that information hang heavily in the stale air. The color that had drained from his face somehow managed to pale even further. He opened his mouth, letting out a weak sound that was half gasp and half sob. He finally understood. I had not come here to threaten him. I had already pulled the trigger 2 days ago. He was a dead man, walking completely oblivious to his own demise while drinking scotch in the ballroom. Before Chase could attempt to formulate a plea for mercy, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed loudly against the heavy wooden doors of the meeting room. The sound was firm and demanding. Diane let out a sudden, terrified whimper from the sofa, curling her legs up tightly beneath her sparkling silver dress. The defense attorney froze completely in his tracks. The heavy brass door handles turned in unison, and the doors were pushed wide open. A group of 5 men and women strode purposefully into the room. 2 of them wore dark suits and carried official state identification badges clipped to their lapels. The other 3 were uniformed police officers from the Chicago Police Department, their heavy utility belts clinking softly as they moved to secure the exit. The lead investigator, a tall, imposing woman with a stern expression, immediately locked her eyes on Chase. She clearly stated his full legal name and asked him to confirm his identity. Chase could barely manage a tiny, pathetic nod of his head. The investigator announced that they possessed a warrant for his immediate arrest on multiple felony charges including wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. The uniformed officers stepped forward, moving with undeniable efficiency. One of the officers firmly grasped Chase by the shoulder, hauling him up from his plush executive chair. Chase stumbled awkwardly, his injured knee buckling slightly under his weight, but the officers held him upright. They spun him around, grabbed his wrists, and pulled his arms firmly behind his back. The metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly into place echoed sharply against the wood-paneled walls. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. Chase began to hyperventilate, his eyes darting frantically as the reality of his arrest set in. He looked over at Diane, but his mother was completely useless, burying her face in the velvet sofa cushions and weeping hysterically as her own impending legal ruin loomed over her. He looked at his defense attorney, who simply shook his head and looked away, washing his hands of the situation. Finally, Chase looked directly at me. His eyes were wide with pure terror. The arrogant man who had aggressively backed me into a corner just a few weeks ago was entirely gone, replaced by a broken criminal begging for a lifeline that did not exist. I simply sat in my chair, my posture perfectly straight, and offered him absolutely nothing in return. I did not smile, and I did not gloat. I just watched him with total indifference as the officers informed him of his rights. The lead investigator instructed the officers to escort him out to the transport vehicles. The heavy wooden doors were pulled open again, and the officers firmly guided Chase out of the quiet boardroom and directly into the brightly lit hallway. I stood up, smoothed the fabric of my emerald green gown, and slowly followed them to the doorway so I could witness the final act of his destruction. They marched him straight down the main corridor and directly into the sprawling grand ballroom. The live jazz band faltered and stumbled to a complete awkward halt as the armed police officers moved through the exact center of the room. The low murmur of hundreds of conversations instantly evaporated, replaced by a stunned, deafening silence. Every single person in the ballroom stopped what they were doing and turned to stare. Wealthy property developers, influential politicians, famous local celebrities and corporate investors watched in absolute shock as the star luxury real estate agent was paraded through the venue in steel handcuffs. I watched the faces of his managing brokerage partners contort with sheer horror as they realized their firm was deeply implicated in a massive financial scandal. Chase kept his head bowed, his face burning with profound shame as the whispers began to ripple rapidly through the crowd. He was forced to limp awkwardly across the polished dance floor, every painful step broadcast to the exact people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. In a matter of seconds, his carefully crafted career, his prestigious social standing, and his entire future were completely and utterly obliterated. I stood quietly in the doorway of the VIP room, watching the heavy brass doors of the ballroom close behind him, knowing absolutely that perfect justice had finally been served. The heavy brass doors sealed shut, cutting off the chaotic murmurs of the ballroom, and I finally turned my attention back to the velvet sofa. Diane was still curled into a tight, trembling ball, her flashy silver gown completely ruined by the spilled champagne soaking into the fabric. She was sobbing hysterically, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in dark, messy streaks. The arrogant, condescending woman, who had spent the last 2 years mocking my working-class background, was entirely gone. In her place was a terrified, broken accomplice who suddenly realized that her lavish lifestyle was over. Roxanne stepped forward, retrieving the massive forensic audit binder from the polished mahogany table and sliding it safely back into her heavy leather briefcase. She looked down at Diane with an expression of absolute professional disdain. Roxanne calmly informed her that the frivolous civil lawsuit and the ridiculous squatter claim had officially died the moment those handcuffs clicked onto her son's wrists. She gave Diane exactly 12 hours to pack her bags, gather her personal belongings, and permanently vacate my downtown condominium. She made it incredibly clear that if Diane was still inside my home by tomorrow morning, the local police would gladly return to arrest her for trespassing and criminal conspiracy. I did not say a single word to her. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the VIP room, leaving her alone to mourn the spectacular death of her fraudulent empire. The following days unfolded exactly as my forensic audit had predicted, delivering a swift, merciless legal reckoning. Chase did not get the opportunity to hire a charismatic defense attorney and spin a sympathetic narrative for the public. The sheer volume of hard, undeniable evidence I had handed over to the district attorney made any defense completely impossible. The state regulatory auditors descended upon his luxury real estate brokerage early Monday morning. They seized every single computer, locked down the client escrow accounts, and formally interviewed the managing partners. Faced with the undeniable reality of the missing funds, the brokerage immediately severed all ties with Chase. They publicly denounced his actions to protect their own firm, completely throwing him to the wolves. The State Real Estate Licensing Board held an emergency administrative hearing and permanently revoked his professional license, ensuring he would never legally sell a piece of property anywhere in the country again. But the loss of his career was the absolute least of his problems. Federal prosecutors officially charged him with multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and felony forgery. Because of the enormous amount of money he had stolen from wealthy, influential clients, the judge considered him a severe flight risk and denied him the opportunity to post bail. The man who had proudly paraded around in tailored designer suits and imported sports cars was now sitting in a cold concrete holding cell, facing a lengthy, inescapable sentence in a federal penitentiary. While Chase sat in federal custody, the immediate financial consequences of his arrest slammed directly into his mother. Diane had built her entire identity around the illusion of immense generational wealth, but her lifestyle was entirely funded by the earnest money her son was actively stealing. Without that continuous illicit cash flow to prop her up, her carefully constructed house of cards collapsed in a matter of hours. True to Roxanne's strict warning, Diane frantically packed her designer clothes and hastily vacated my condominium before sunrise on Saturday morning. She tried to retreat to the comfortable, privileged existence she believed she deserved, but reality caught up with her in the most humiliating way possible. By Tuesday afternoon, the bank holding the lease on her luxury sport utility vehicle initiated an emergency repossession. A tow truck arrived at the upscale grocery store, where she was attempting to shop, and hooked up her pristine, expensive car right in the middle of the parking lot. She was forced to stand on the sidewalk holding her reusable shopping bags in utter disbelief as the physical symbols of her fake wealth were literally dragged away from her. The cascading financial ruin did not stop there. The exclusive elite country club she obsessively worshipped immediately caught wind of the massive federal embezzlement scandal. The wealthy members, terrified of being associated with such a high-profile criminal enterprise, quickly moved to sever all ties. The board of directors held a swift vote and formally revoked her membership, completely banning her from the sprawling manicured grounds and the elegant dining rooms she loved to flaunt. Diane desperately tried to reach out to the tight-knit circle of high society friends she had spent years cultivating. She called the affluent women she used to drink champagne with, hoping to secure a temporary place to stay or a sympathetic ear. But the high society crowd in Chicago is notoriously ruthless when it comes to scandal. Every single one of her phone calls was sent directly to voicemail. Her text messages were universally ignored, and she was swiftly blocked across all social media platforms. The very people she had bragged to about putting me in my place were now treating her like an absolute pariah. She had dedicated her entire life to climbing the social ladder, stepping on anyone she deemed beneath her, only to discover that her elite friends viewed her as nothing more than a toxic liability. Completely shunned, blacklisted, and entirely out of money, Diane had absolutely no safety net left to catch her fall. With her credit score destroyed by the sudden halt in stolen funds and her name plastered across the local news in connection to the escrow scandal, she could not secure a lease in any of the luxury downtown high-rises she deemed acceptable. She was ultimately forced to move into a tiny run-down one-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. The building was old, poorly maintained, and miles away from the designer boutiques and five-star restaurants she considered her natural habitat. There were no doormen to greet her, no valet parking, and certainly no marble kitchen islands to lean against while demanding money from other people. She was completely isolated in a cramped, drafty space, surrounded only by the cheap plastic suitcases holding whatever clothes she had managed to carry out of my home. The profound, bitter irony of the situation was entirely perfect. She had spent 2 years mocking my working-class background, aggressively claiming that I lacked the proper breeding to understand true luxury. Now, because of her own blinding greed and her son's criminal arrogance, she was trapped in the exact kind of impoverished, struggling lifestyle she had always so viciously despised. She had lost her precious social status, her stolen wealth, and her golden child all in one single devastating weekend. The universe had delivered a flawless, unyielding stroke of karma, forcing her to finally experience the harsh, unforgiving reality she had always believed she was fundamentally too important to endure. The absolute totality of their ruin was a testament to the fact that fraudulent foundations always eventually crumble, leaving nothing but dust in their wake. And as she sat completely alone in that tiny apartment, completely disconnected from the glamorous world she had so desperately sought to conquer, she was finally forced to confront the profound emptiness of her own miserable, deeply arrogant existence. She had absolutely no one left to blame but herself for her absolute unrecoverable downfall. While Diane wallowed in the miserable reality she had created for herself, my own life was rapidly clearing of the toxic debris they had left behind. First thing Monday morning, Roxanne called me with a deeply satisfied tone in her voice. She informed me that the frivolous civil lawsuit Chase had filed against me had been completely and officially withdrawn. His original attorney had already fled the situation, and the overwhelmed public defender assigned to his federal criminal case took one look at the sheer absurdity of the assault and emotional distress claims and immediately filed the paperwork to drop them. Chase had absolutely zero leverage, zero funds, and zero credibility left to pursue a fake civil grievance while simultaneously facing decades in federal prison. The legal threat that had once loomed over my career and my home simply evaporated into thin air, leaving me with a profound, unobstructed sense of relief. With the evictions successfully enforced and the legal battles entirely dismissed, it was finally time for me to return home. Walking back into my downtown Chicago condominium for the first time since the night of the attack was a deeply surreal experience. The physical space was exactly as I had left it, but the energy in the rooms felt entirely different. The lingering scent of his expensive cologne had faded, replaced by the sterile, empty silence of a vacant apartment. I stood in the center of my kitchen, looking at the exact spot by the marble island where he had aggressively cornered me and raised his fist. I did not feel fear as I looked at the floorboards where he had collapsed in agony. I only felt an intense, overwhelming need to completely purge the space of his memory. I refused to live in a museum dedicated to a fraudulent relationship. I did not just hire a professional cleaning crew to scrub the floors and wash the windows. I initiated a massive, comprehensive renovation of the entire condominium to completely erase any remaining trace of Chase and Diane from my sanctuary. I hired a team of luxury contractors and interior designers to completely transform the environment. I had the hardwood floors ripped up and replaced with rich, dark espresso wood that completely changed the warmth and character of the living space. I threw out the expensive linen sofa where he had staged his pathetic, fabricated injury photo for social media. I replaced it with sleek, modern furniture that reflected my own personal taste, not the flashy, ostentatious style he had always preferred. I hired painters to cover the walls in fresh, calming shades of deep blue and crisp white, erasing the neutral beige tones Diane had arrogantly claimed to favor during her brief, illegitimate stay in my guest room. I even had the heavy brass fixtures in the kitchen entirely replaced, ensuring that my hands would never have to touch the same hardware his had touched. The physical labor of the renovation became an incredibly therapeutic process for me. Every swing of a hammer, every fresh coat of paint, and every piece of old furniture carried out the front door felt like a heavy, emotional weight being permanently lifted from my shoulders. I was not just remodeling a piece of real estate. I was actively reclaiming my personal territory, restoring my safe haven, and physically manifesting the absolute control I had fought so fiercely to maintain. By the time the contractors finally packed up their tools and left a month later, my home was utterly unrecognizable to the man who had tried to steal it. It was completely, undeniably mine. While I was busy rebuilding my personal sanctuary, my professional life experienced a sudden astronomical surge in success. The high society real estate gala had been packed with influential corporate figures, wealthy property investors, and prominent business leaders. The spectacular, highly public nature of Chase's arrest did not stay a secret for long. Whispers and rumors rapidly circulated through the elite financial circles of Chicago, and the stunning truth about my involvement quickly became an open secret in the industry. The wealthy elite learned that I had not just survived a toxic relationship, but that I had single-handedly uncovered a massive federal embezzlement ring, compiled a flawless forensic audit over a single weekend, and orchestrated a perfectly timed takedown that handed a seasoned criminal directly to state regulators. Instead of viewing me as a victim of a messy public scandal, the corporate world viewed me as an absolute, undeniable force of nature. My consulting firm was suddenly flooded with urgent inquiries from massive corporate clients, high net worth individuals, and prestigious law firms who desperately wanted to hire the forensic accountant who possessed that level of ruthless, calculating brilliance. My business phone rang constantly, with requests for high-stakes financial audits, complex asset tracking, and corporate fraud investigations. My calendar filled up months in advance, and I was forced to quickly expand my team, hiring several new junior accountants just to manage the overwhelming influx of highly lucrative contracts. The vicious digital smear campaign Chase had tried to use to destroy my career had ultimately served as the greatest marketing campaign I could have ever asked for. His attempt to ruin me had inadvertently catapulted my professional reputation into the stratosphere, solidifying my status as one of the most formidable financial minds in the entire city. A few short months after the incredibly dramatic and chaotic events in the VIP room, the overwhelming dust had finally settled completely. Chase was securely locked away in a federal facility, awaiting a trial. He was absolutely guaranteed to lose. Diane was entirely isolated in her miserable, cramped apartment, permanently exiled from the luxury she craved. I, on the other hand, was exactly where I was always meant to be. On a very warm, breezy Friday evening, I stepped out onto the newly renovated balcony of my downtown condominium. The city of Chicago stretched out before me, a glittering, endless sea of bright lights and towering skyscrapers, reflecting beautifully off the dark, churning waters of the river below. The sounds of the bustling city traffic and the distant wail of sirens felt like a comforting, familiar symphony. I walked over to the edge of the glass railing, holding a delicate crystal glass filled with an incredibly expensive, full-bodied red wine that I had purchased simply because I wanted it and I could easily afford it. I took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the rich, complex flavors settle on my tongue as the cool evening breeze brushed against my face. I looked out over the magnificent skyline, taking a moment to deeply reflect on the incredible journey of the past few months. They had targeted me because they truly believed my working-class background made me weak. They had severely underestimated my intelligence, my resilience, and my absolute refusal to be a victim. They thought they could strip me of my wealth, my home, and my dignity. Instead, I had methodically stripped them of their freedom, their status, and their entirely fraudulent reality. I leaned against the sturdy glass railing, a quiet, profound smile touching the corners of my mouth. I took another slow sip of my wine, breathing in the crisp night air, completely reveling in the absolute peace, power, and freedom I had permanently secured through my own unwavering brilliance, my relentless dedication, and my absolute refusal to ever let anyone else dictate the ultimate course of my beautiful life. Looking back on everything that happened, the greatest lesson I learned was not just about the importance of financial independence or holding people accountable. It was a profound realization about self-worth. For too long, society conditions us to believe we must compromise our boundaries to keep the peace, especially with those who claim to love us. We are taught to shrink ourselves to accommodate the fragile egos of others. But true partnership never requires you to surrender your dignity or your hard-earned security to prove your loyalty. When you refuse to be a victim, you strip toxic individuals of their absolute greatest weapon. Chase and Diane truly believed that my background made me weak. They mistook my patience for compliance. But the exact moment I stopped reacting with raw emotion and started responding with cold, undeniable facts, their entire empire of lies collapsed. You do not have to scream to be heard, and you never have to stoop to their level to win. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply stepping into your own undeniable power, exposing the harsh truth to the light of day, and walking away completely unbothered. If you are currently trapped in a situation where your boundaries are being tested or your worth is being minimized, please remember this fact. You have the absolute strength to rewrite your own story. Do not let anyone make you feel small in your own home. Have you ever had to stand your ground against someone you thought you could trust? How did you find the courage to walk away? Share your story in the comments below. If this journey of reclaiming power resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you for listening, and remember that your peace is always worth fighting for.